speak. This person is someone I met at my first ever meeting, so I thought it would be great to have him speak today. So anyway, without further ado, I'd like to, Ted, if you're there, I'd like to introduce Ted D from New Jersey.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I can't seem to start my video, which may be best for everybody involved. But yeah, my name's Ted. I'm an alcoholic, person in recovery. I identify myself as an alcoholic. Oh, here we go. Got the video start. As you can see, I'm standing outside underneath some pine trees, so I don't broadcast my entire company that I'm an alcoholic. Maybe some negative repercussions to that. But yeah, as Bridget said, I met her at our home group. It's a candlelight meeting on Friday nights, and we're both in the class 2019, so to speak. I still remember the first meeting when she walked in, and you know, just a quick aside, it's been amazing to see how much she's grown in her sobriety and just the ways that she's really blossomed as a person. You know, which is proof to me that this program works in all of its many iterations. And you know, the part from the big book where they say to wear it like a loose garment is something I take to heart. So yeah, I'm going to try to share, you know, a bit of my experience, strength, and hopefully some hope in this, you know, in this program as I've experienced it. You know, as I said, I'm an alcoholic, and as you're all aware, this is a, you know, a secular recovery group. I don't get the opportunity to make too many secular meetings, and it's a pleasure when I do, though, because I don't have to go through the motions, or you know, for me in my recovery, a lot of times it's easier just to gloss over the whole God thing and sit, you know, and just go along to get along, because really at this point I don't give a damn, and I'm not, you know, I'm an agnostic myself, and so whatever anybody else believes, whatever the religion is, as long as they're not trying to ram it down my throat or make me believe something different, you know, to each their own. And if it helps people maintain their sobriety, that's fantastic. You know, but going into a bit of my background, you know, I grew up in a family full of alcoholics, with alcoholism going back on both sides of the family, for as many generations as anybody can remember, as you know, as far as the oral family history would bear out. And so I grew up, you know, with all the isms that come with alcoholism. I definitely, you know, if there's a nature and nurture side of this, I got both, I think. You know, I didn't know there were alcoholic behaviors at the time, but I grew up living in fear of my own shadow. I was taught to feel shame for everything. And if I've had nothing to feel shameful about, you know, I was taught to feel fearful and shameful, because that meant I was probably doing something that I was doing something bad that I didn't yet realize was something to feel shameful or guilty about. And so I grew up very much feeling uncomfortable in my own skin, you know, feeling uncomfortable being emotionally truthful with anybody, much less my parents. And, you know, I grew up looking for an escape any way that I could get it. You know, and early on for me, that, you know, I found my early escape in books. And so, you know, and that became my identity. I wanted to be the person who read a lot of books. I wanted to be the smartest person in the room. And so I focused on learning things, but I didn't really focus on my education. I didn't apply myself to any extent in school. I was one of those lucky kids who was able to get by and do well on tests, but I almost never did any of my homework. You know, and that right there, I avoided accountability. And that worked for a little while. It even worked up through high school until I got to college. You know, that just gives you a bit of a background on kind of who I am and how I am in some ways. But more importantly, my drinking career itself started late, relatively late, compared to some of the people I meet in the rooms. I um, I didn't pick up my first drink until I was almost 21. It was, a few months shy of my 21st birthday. And that's because I grew up being, told by my grandmother, my mother, how terrible alcohol was, how it made my father a bad person, how it made my father or grandfathers bad people, my great grandfathers, and the damage it had done to the family, that I should be afraid of alcohol. And so I grew up afraid of alcohol. Um, that was until I had 2 years of community college under my belt, just enough philosophy to be a danger to myself, where I thought, well, how can I really make any judgment against this drinking thing if I haven't had any empirical experience with it? And looking back, if I was really that great of a philosopher and, was able to avoid logical fallacy as well as I thought I could, I would have recognized a few things up front. Because before I ever started drinking, I was already coming up with rules for myself, um, to not be an alcoholic. And looking back on it, if you're trying to define how not to be an alcoholic and to design your drinking around not being an alcoholic before you ever pick up your first drink, uh, you know, might be a sign that you're at pretty good risk, of developing a drinking problem. And so, among my rules were, I would limit myself to only having expensive, liquors and wines and beers, because as a 20-year-old college student, surely if I cultivated the taste only for the finest booze, I couldn't afford to become an alcoholic. And so my first drink was with my oldest brother, who, was a college professor actually at the college that the 4-year college I wound up attending, and it was a 21-year-old Scotch. Um, and that's when really the second warning sign cropped up for me, and one that I completely missed. They say in the big book that the alcohol problem, it's mental, physical, and spiritual. And given the context of this group, we could leave or take the spiritual part of it. I'll explain my own rationalization for what spiritualism is to me later on, and you can agree or disagree. Feel free. Uh, but the physical part, while they describe it as an allergy, and I'm not sure I agree. It's an allergy is what we know now. An allergy is typically a release of histamine and the activation of your body's immune response to something foreign. Um, I'm not sure that really fits for alcoholism. I know there's definitely a change, but turns out I am actually allergic to Scotch. And more specifically, any alcohol that's been prepared by smoking malt, and that includes the smoked beers. And so I woke up, after having just 2 shots of Scotch, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck and poisoned simultaneously. And it should have been the second sign. And instead of just avoiding alcohol altogether, I said, well, maybe I'll try something different next time. And so my drinking career, it started off innocuously enough. I didn't pick up and go full throttle, as some people will, but it was progressive for me. And so, yeah, I mean, the alcoholism in my family and the isms that carried through for the people who didn't have that, progressed. And I went through some difficult times in college as a student. The money that had been set aside for my education had been stolen by one of my relatives, and I almost dropped out of college. And reason I bring that up is it was a formative experience for me, and that was the first time I learned to apply myself, and that's when I started taking school seriously. Is when I had to start paying for it myself. And my last 2 years of college, I really worked hard and I pulled my grades up, and I got off to a start in a promising career as a chemist. I studied chemistry in undergraduate, and I went into the industrial chemistry world as a paint chemist. Not going to get too much into the details of paint chemistry. Yes, a huge part of that job is watching paint dry and monitoring how long it takes for paint to dry. And most of it's exactly as boring as you would imagine. There are some cool applications, and there's, brings up good opportunities. But the isms persisted with me. My drinking, while not out of control, might not necessarily have been healthy at that point. But through hard work and the opportunities I had through my job, I was sent to Italy in the late fall of 2013. And this was a transformative moment for me, because this was setting me up for my first bottom, or the start of my alcoholic run. So I went to Italy, and like maybe some people in this room can identify with me, but for people who grew up with mental illness, and I could consider alcoholism to be in part a mental illness in their family, people tend to attract people with similar mental illnesses, especially if their mental illness is untreated, or at least that's been my experience. And so I was sent to Italy to live for 6 months for my job. My first weekend there, I was able to do the one magical thing that I've always been able to do and seem to inherit from my parents. And this is a superpower that transcends language barriers, by the way. Maybe some people can identify with this, but my first weekend when I was in Italy, it was my birthday. I went to a wine bar, and I met and quickly gravitated to the most mentally unstable person in that room. And I got into a long-term relationship with that person. And to keep things moving along here, that relationship, turned into a marriage proposal. And my now ex-fiance at the time, I believe, had some substance abuse problems. I mean, they were a great person in many ways, but in retrospect, it seems pretty obvious they had some issues. And long story short, at the end of that 6 months, I wanted to stay in Italy. I had lined up some prospective jobs, and the company that I was working with said, well, your time is up. You can either come work at our corporate offices, or you can do something else. And I was engaged at that time, and I said, okay, I'm going to do something else. And I quit that job. I cashed out my 401k, and I was depending on my fiance to secure housing for us in Italy because my company housing had expired. And as you may be able to infer at this point, I live in New Jersey in the United States. I'm not happily married in Italy. And so that didn't work out. And all that groundwork brings me up to this point. This was my crossroads. I found myself relatively cash rich, heartbroken. I'd sold most of my possessions. And suddenly every day was the weekend for me. And I apologize for the cicadas. I probably shouldn't be standing under a tree in August expecting anything different. But yeah, I started, every day was on the weekend, and that's when I really started to drink heavily. And I drank the better part of a fifth of some hard brown liquor every day starting in late May of 2014 until 2016, when I had my first experience with anxiety as a disease. And that kind of woke me up. I mean, at that point, I realized I was an alcoholic, but I wasn't sure what to do about it at that point. And so I went to a doctor, and he gave me some benzodiazepines, and that helped with withdrawals. And I got a book called The 90-Day Sobriety Solution. And I stayed dry for maybe, I think at that point, that was 8 months. But the damage had been done. I had found a second job at the end of the summer in 2014, and I proceeded to show up every single day hungover to a lesser or greater extent. And unsurprisingly, that led to me being terminated from that job, even though I had come clean to my employer, said I had an issue. I had stayed dry. It wound up not working out. And so, then I went on to my next employment gap and I got a job as a bouncer at a bar, which, if you're trying to stay sober, not a real good idea when one of the perks is, half price drinks after your shift. And so I found my next job in Eastern Illinois, and my drinking career picked up there, and then the consequences started to pile up. And so then I started winding up in the hospital. I got pancreatitis 2 times in 2 years. If that's not proof that this is a mental disease, I mean, I got it the first time, and for anybody who's not had pancreatitis, the best way I can describe it shortly is it's like having a bear inside of your stomach who is trying to eat its way out of you. And no sane person who knows what caused that would go and do the exact same thing over again, or even take the risk of that. It's like the guy in the Big Book, the allegory, the guy who goes and walks in front of cars for a thrill. That's exactly what I did. And so to fast forward, after my second time in the hospital, I decided to seek more help, but not AA, because I didn't want to, I guess I didn't want to admit I was an alcoholic in front of a group of people. But I started seeing a counselor, and after a month of seeing a counselor and being discharged from the hospital, I made one of the best bad decisions of my life. And I decided I was ready for another committed relationship, and I met the woman who's now my wife. And I was lucky. I mean, it was pure luck of the draw. I don't know what caused her not to run away from me. She tells me it's because I cooked her a very nice steak one time, even though she saw what a disaster my apartment was. But what that did for my wife didn't make me get sober, and I didn't get sober for my wife. I got sober for myself. But she did break part of a cycle. She is generally a normal person who functions at a high level. And what she did is she held up a very unflattering mirror in front of me. And it's not that the mirror itself made me look unflattering, it's that it didn't distort the image. And I saw exactly what I was and what was wrong with me, in a way that I couldn't escape. And I saw a life that I wanted, and didn't know how to attain, because I knew if I kept drinking, I would eventually, lose the opportunity to be with a really incredible person. And so it took another 6 months. I moved from Illinois to be in near Manhattan with her, and my bottom kind of rose to meet me. I didn't get pancreatitis again, but I did get a new job. I went on one of my first business trips. I got blackout drunk at an airport. I fell down. I hit my face on the ground. I passed out, woke up in a hospital. And because my credit was so bad and I didn't have a credit card, I had to call my future wife and browbeat her into paying for a hotel for me for a night. And then I lied to her and told her that I tripped and fell down. And so a week later, when she asked to see the medical discharge papers, I doctored them, because the first thing it said was, extreme intoxication and then cranial trauma. And so, I spent the better part of a day at work trying to doctor that paperwork just right. And I brought it home and I put it down in front of her, and she looked at it for 2 seconds and said, "Well, that's fake." The thing I neglected to mention is my wife worked for a long time in financial and medical accounting fraud. And so she spotted that there's a line that was supposed to be perfectly straight, and there's a little tiny squiggle, from the copying a bunch of times and cutting and pasting. And it took her a nanosecond to see it. And so, yeah, August 11th of 2019 is when I walked into my first AA meeting. It was conveniently a block and a half away from my home. It's a meeting that's my, one of my current home groups. I have 2 home groups. And I met my first sponsor, and my first sponsor was easily one of the most loving people that I've ever met. And if I had to point to one human who is pure of an embodiment of love as anybody I've ever met, it'd be that man, a man named Scott S. And I came into the rooms terrified. I was unsure what to do. All I knew is that I was beat, and I would try anything, even if it meant having to talk about, God or religion, because I was very strongly atheist and agnostic at that point. But I didn't know what else to do. Um, and Scott laid it out. He said, you don't have to believe in God. You don't have to. He said, all you have to do is, identify a power that's greater than yourself, a higher power. It doesn't have to be a deity. It doesn't have to be a God. Scott was Jewish, and so he had his concept of God. But he took me in easy, and he laid the tools down at my feet. And I had the pleasure of working with Scott for a year as I meticulously overworked my first 4 steps. I know I'm kind of coming up against the time limit here. I'll try to wrap it up within 5 minutes or so. Okay, Bridget's saying keep talking. So yeah, I worked with Scott, like I said, the first year. I met Bridget. I met a bunch of great people within that first year. And a huge transformation took place. I mean, just within the first 90 days of my sobriety. And I'm going to back it up real quick. My first meeting was August 11th of 2019. My sobriety date is August 14th, 2019. So I celebrated 3 years yesterday. But the reason I point that out is not because I celebrated 3 years. It's because there's a 3-day gap in between my first meeting and my sobriety date. That first meeting, I met, the man who said he'd be my temporary sponsor, became my long-term sponsor. He said, well, what are you doing tomorrow? You need to find you a meeting. I said, I'm going on a business trip to Chicago. And he said, well, that's a real bad idea. And I said, okay, well, I got to go. And he said, well, you need to find a meeting out there. This is how you do it. And I didn't listen to him. But I got a bunch of phone numbers, and I went on that business trip, and I didn't know to look out for the high highs and the low lows. I had hope at that point, which I hadn't had in a long time. And so I was riding a high. And by the end of that first day on that business trip, because things were going so well, I wound up at a liquor store with a bottle of bourbon, and that's where I stayed for the next 2 days, missing 2 days out of that business trip. Until Wednesday morning, after desperately, clinging to the hotel room bed and trying to, taking pills to deal with the anxiety and try to convince myself not to walk on the middle of I-55 expressway to kill myself because I didn't know how I'd gotten back in that position. That's when I surrendered, and I picked up the phone and did something I'd never done before. And I called the man who was going to be my sponsor. And it's all right. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. And so I did. I went to 89 meetings in 90 days. Because I'm being honest. I went on a trip with my future wife, and I made meetings every day in California, for a week and a half when we were out there. And I saw a whole bunch of different sobriety. And I went to my first secular meeting in San Francisco, which was awesome. And that actually played a huge part in my sobriety because I knew that was something that existed, and I didn't have to, grab onto a Judeo-Christian God, and it didn't matter what anybody else said. I just needed a higher power. And that was a huge thing for me. And so, yeah, we worked through the first year together. The pandemic came. One of the local meetings opened up and we went to that meeting together, but the pandemic was not kind to Scott, my sponsor. And on November 11th of 2020, Scott gave me, the worst type of gift that nobody would ask for and nobody would really identify as a gift until you get said gift and you have a couple seconds to reflect on it. And what happened is, Scott lost his business. He was battling with depression. He declared bankruptcy, and unfortunately he took his life on November 11th. We were getting ready to do my 5th step, which has nothing to do with that. But when I say he gave me a gift, the gift he gave me was my first tragedy in sobriety, my first real hard blow. The pandemic wasn't that, it didn't seem tragic to me, at least not on a personal level. But when Scott took himself out of this world and took himself out of my life, he left me literally with a toolkit at my feet And that's what, and so I got the news and I was heartbroken. His sponsor had called me, but I knew exactly what to do next. And so what I did next is I told my boss, I had a close family friend. They died today. I'm upset. I need to take the afternoon off. I went out to my car and I called up the man who was going to be my next sponsor, who is a friend of both Scott and myself. And his name is Rich. He's my sponsor now. And I called him. I said, Rich, Scott was missing last night. I told you his wife was worried, and the worst has happened. I found out today that he killed himself. I said, I don't know how I'm going to get through this, but I do know that I need your help, and at the very least, I need you to step in and temporarily sponsor me to help me get through this. And that most incredible thing about AA is I reached out, and he really held up the tradition, and without missing a heartbeat, he said, "Dude, I got you. We're going to get through this together. We're going to go through your step work, and we're going to grieve, and it's going to be difficult. And you're going to feel angry. And you're going to go through a whole bunch of emotions." And I went through all the things that he said would happen. So, but we're going to work on your sobriety, and that's what happened. And Rich was a bit more of an ass kicker than Scott, and that's what I needed. And we got through, all 12 steps over the next 2 months. And and even though Rich is a guy who believes in God, he doesn't force me to believe in God. He lets me have my higher power, and that's where we're at today. I just recently got my first sponsee, and that's, my sobriety felt like it was starting to stagnate, and I knew I needed a sponsee. But I've been dealing with some mental health things over the past year, and through working with a doctor, a psychiatrist, I finally got my medication to a place where I'm not suffering terrible anxiety, I'm not suffering depression, and I can be of service to other people, and I'm ready to have a sponsee. And sure enough, as soon as the opposite of the idiom, as soon as the student is ready, the teacher appears. Well, as soon as me, the teacher, was ready, the student appeared, and I recognized that opportunity, and it has been absolutely, another seismic shift in my sobriety. And so I'm going to wrap it up here pretty quick. I'm just going to leave you kind of with where I'm at, because this is a secular meeting. There are some things I do as a secular person, as an agnostic, that might leave you with some questions. But I do pray, even though I'm agnostic. And I call myself a spiritual person, not necessarily because I know that there's a God out there. I'm not going to try to prove a negative. But I do believe that we're all connected. Everything in the universe is connected. If nothing else, by the space-time continuum. Every action leaves ripples that run out as waves of gravity, at the very least, through space-time. And so everything is interconnected on a fundamental level. Everything obeys certain fundamental laws. My higher power, to put it succinctly, rests in the gaps of knowledge that that humankind hasn't been able to fill in. The gap between general relativity and quantum mechanics, where we can't explain, because the two don't resolve. Quantum mechanics on a large level leads to the collapse of the universe in this horrible quantum foam. And general relativity on a small scale means that the universe flings itself apart and can't hold itself together. And yet there's something keeping this whole thing ticking, and I don't know what it is. And I alone, I'm not going to find out what it is. But somehow this universe keeps ticking along, and I'm part of it. And despite the divisions that people seem to find to differentiate themselves, I think more or less people are very, very similar. We're all driven by common things. And when you are given the gift of a people who are confronting a problem that is way bigger than themselves, they set aside so many of those differences and really begin to behave altruistically towards one another, which is something I found in recovery. And so my higher power, it's the gaps in human knowledge and the actions of people that fill in those gaps and reconcile those differences, and the altruism that I find in people who are trying to better themselves, and who, when I reach out, put themselves there for me, if for no other reason, simply because I know that somebody was there when they were at their lowest ebb in life, and they're just paying it forward, and that's incredibly powerful to me. And so I'm going to leave it with prayer. The reason that I pray um, is because I heard a good kind of atheist explanation for prayer. There's been a psychological study done that shows, at the very least, if you suspend your disbelief, and you pray to something, um, you can kind of use cognitive dissonance to your advantage. And to me, that's where spirituality has helped me with sobriety. I've used cognitive dissonance, which is irrationally holding two opposing beliefs, to overcome a completely irrational disease. I mean, alcoholism cannot be rationed, at least for me. For me as an alcoholic, I cannot rationalize myself out of alcoholism. It's a completely illogical disease. It's a mental illness. And yet, by suspending my disbelief, by pretending maybe there's something out there that cares for me, by using the Guardian or Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy definition of flying, by only avoiding hitting the ground, you manage to fly. By avoiding picking up a drink and doing anything else, trying to do the next right thing and putting it in the power, of something, the better human spirit, the universe, whatever you want to call it. By focusing on anything else, at the very least, if all else fails, by focusing on anything else, I can avoid picking up a drink. And and at this point, if it means I'm behaving irrationally, well, one, I'm a human. I'm incapable of behaving completely rationally. I can certainly endeavor to do so, and I know I'll always fail at some point in that endeavor. But two, if the medicine, in this instance works, and I'm not hurting anybody, and I'm only benefiting myself by fooling myself into thinking momentarily that there's some, flying spaghetti monster or space ghost or whatever that cares about me enough to keep me from doing something stupid and hurting myself. If it keeps me from picking up a drink, I'll take it. I have the rest of my life to learn and to make connections with people who know more than I do, and to point me, down a path, and I can refine my concept of the universe and my relationship to it, and ultimately, hopefully, learn some greater truth. And if I come to the end and I really don't, come away with a unified theory or a complete explanation, worst case, I'll cease to exist. My consciousness will evaporate, and I'll have hopefully spent the remainder of my existence adding to the benefit and the some small part to the completion of the realm of knowledge that humans can understand. Secondarily, I'll have lived my life in service to other people and try to help other people avoid continued suffering. And tertiarily, if nothing else, I'm confident I will have enjoyed much more of my life not having picked up a drink, with the benefit of maybe some suspension of disbelief and magical thinking that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to escape, left to my own devices. And that's what I got. Thank you for listening.